Most of the things that scare most people are ubiquitous banalities. You might have suspected this even before you grew up, and realized that it really is all about death and taxes. But if you're like me, an all-American boy raised on the films of Canadian David Cronenberg and Dutchman Paul Verhoeven, you quickly gravitate towards the more cosmic horrors. And this leads you, inevitably, to Lovecraft, and just as inevitably, to disappointment in the state of films based on his work. There's a lot of reasons for this. Like a certain other early 20th century author we're about to talk about in a second, Lovecraft did most of his best work in descriptive prose. Purple prose, we critics call it when we're feeling generous, and when we're not, we call it overwriting and label it the worst kind of self-indulgent excess. But there's no denying that even in the depths of his excesses, the man could turn a fucking phrase. Usually when we say that about someone, it's because one particular passage manages to stand out to us amidst all the dreck. But with Lovecraft, you have exactly the opposite problem. It's hard just to pick one. Almost every paragraph. Hell, every compound complex sentence contains enough jewels to be the envy of any dwarf city in Middle-earth. I mean, for God's sake, just listen to this. I shall never sleep calmly again when I think of the horrors that lurk ceaselessly behind life in time and in space, and of those unhallowed blasphemies from elder stars which dream beneath the sea, known and favored by a nightmare cult ready and eager to loose them on the world, whenever another earthquake shall heave their monstrous stone city again to the sun and air. And that would, of course, be, as described on the facing page, the nightmare corpse city of R'lyeh, that was built in measureless aeons beyond history by the vast, loathsome shapes that seeped down from the dark stars. There lay great Cthulhu and his hordes, hidden in green, slimy vaults, and sending out at last, after cycles incalculable, the thoughts that spread fear to the dreams of the sensitive, and called imperiously to the faithful to come on a pilgrimage of liberation and restoration. Now, honestly, how in Dante's hell do you turn that into a film? Most of the time the answer is you don't. Or you make a movie that vaguely references those unhallowed blasphemies, while spending most of its time on cheaper, more easily filmed antagonists. Like that nightmare cult. Everybody loves a good nightmare cult. Except, of course, when they seep into your real life and become a nightmare from which you can never wake. Topical joke. And then, in 2005, the H.P. Lovecraft Historical Society gave us this. An adaptation of one of Lovecraft's best-loved and most well-known works, especially after its titular monster became a meme. But that's the internet, ruining everything since 1995? 6? 4? Meh. Depends on where you are, I guess. The H.P. Lovecraft Historical Society, for its part, is a collection of good upstanding nerds who united originally in the middle 80s. Around the live-action role-playing game that is also called Call of Cthulhu, so I'm not really surprised that they made this movie first. Their scope's obviously expanded since their LARPing days, to the point where they've become their own little media empire all unto themselves. They produce their own music, their own radio plays to go with the music, which is awesome, and tons of their own swag, of course, something some of us still have to get around to. And then there's this, their first feature film. Though at 45 minutes it's about half the length of your standard feature. But then again, I've been trapped in the land of 2.5-hour action-adventure PG-13 extravaganzas for months, so I'm not going to hold that against them. It's not the size of the boat, it's the motion of the ocean. As the Society's website says, they like to imagine a world where Lovecraft was famous in his own time. What if, they ask, Hollywood of the 1920s came knocking on Lovecraft's door? To answer that, they gave us a silent, black-and-white film full of miniatures, forced perspective, stop motion, and more Dutch angles than an entire season of Batman 66. Also, big, broad acting. Not quite broad enough to be period appropriate, but then again, that style of acting has long since passed beyond the reach of time. It is by far and away the most faithful adaptation of a Lovecraft story ever put to film. Not just because it resisted the urge to throw in unnecessary filler just so it could hit the 90-minute mark, but also because it maintains a style and tone that I can honestly call Lovecraftian without feeling the need to sacrifice any body parts in penance. A lot of motherfuckers like to throw that one around casually, but I'm of a mind to save it for when it's most appropriate. A lot of that's down to the music, which has the job of doing all the heavy emotional lifting, as it did back in the days when every theater had a dude in the back with a keyboard, and every decent theater had a full orchestra. I hear a lot of ragtime piano in there, honestly, but the jaunty melodies that phrase usually implies only come up the once during a scene transition to what's supposed to be happier times. For the most part, the piano is turned to more sinister purposes, as are the horns, strings, the drums, ooh, perfect drums, and the occasional creepy ambient noise, usually associated with more explicitly experimental music. That's an entirely modern touch, as are this thing's editing and shot composition. Modern editing keeps the pace taut, and makes sure this whole thing clocks in an austere 45 minutes. While he did tend to go on, Lovecraft almost always wrote short stories. No adaptation is perfect, though, and this one does wind up making a few strategic story changes. Instead of hunkering over his desk, feverishly writing all of this out, our unnamed narrator starts out literally narrating all of this to his psychiatrist. And this guy's the first in a nesting doll of unreliable narrators whose stories will take on the form of branching flashbacks. It's a very smart way to translate the epistolary nature of this story. To read Call of Cthulhu is to read some guy repeat to you what he's read in increasingly elaborate fashion, each subtale of the larger tale becoming more horrifying than the last. I like to believe this is by design because it flows so damn well. From creepy nightmares, to body horror, to nightmare cults, to giant monsters from ancient cities that can only be described in language usually reserved for Escher paintings. Our narrator's story begins then with a cache of documents he discovered upon the death of his great-uncle, a professor of Semitic languages at Brown University in beautiful Providence, Rhode Island, the city that Lovecraft loved the most. Once upon a time, so the documents describe, great-uncle Professor met a young architect named Henry Wilcox. Wilcox once showed up on great-uncle Professor's door with a bas-relief of a monster covered in ancient script. Something he'd sculpted, Wilcox said, after having a prophetic dream. A nightmarish city built long ago when the stars aligned and monster gods first seeped down into our planet. Wilcox's dreams only got worse as the month of March 1925 wore on, eventually driving him to the hospital, where, just as suddenly, he recovered in early April. Great-uncle Professor's documents reveal similar outbreaks of madness-inducing dreams occurring simultaneously the world over, as if some ancient psychic monster woke up in March 1925 and began broadcasting a worldwide signal. Most couldn't hear it, but it's like the country music radio station. It's out there, in the air, even if you're not tuned into it. From here, we flash back to the reason Great-Uncle Professor even countenanced the bad dreams of weird art students in the first place. A meeting of the American Archaeological Society in 1908, crashed by one Inspector Legras of New Orleans' finest, who brought in a very distinctive statue for identification. We, of course, immediately recognize the resemblance to Wilcox's sculpture, and here Inspector Legras takes over narrator duties, telling the assembled scientists that he found the statue in a raid on a suspected voodoo cult in 1907. Here's where I pause to give one reason why I'm actually glad 1920s Hollywood didn't get a hold of Lovecraft. If they had, all the cultists in this scene would have probably wound up looking like the natives of Skull Island from original King Kong. Here they wind up looking like neo-primitivist hippies on a camping trip. Really, we're still such a puritanical culture that the best way to scare anybody with a bunch of cultists is to get them all naked. But of course you gotta pay people extra for that. And this is an indie production on a tight budget. I love the fog machine-shrouded landscape that plays South Louisiana here. It reminds me of the Universal monster movies of my youth. As does all the shoe polish on the cultists' teeth to make them look more degenerate. Their real object of worship was, of course, Great Cthulhu, an ancient god monster whose kind once ruled the earth from his city of R'lyeh. That city sunk beneath the waves ages ago, and the movie does a great job underlying some obvious parallels here by having our narrator dream of, and his great-uncle read, infamous 19th century crackpot William Scott Eliot's Story of Atlantis and the Lost Lemuria. But Cthulhu's cult lives on. They spread across the world and continued their worship in secret, like a giant tapeworm stretching through all of humanity's guts. Our original narrator takes back the reins here to explain how he tried to set aside all of these horrors, until a chance encounter with a newspaper clipping about a ship limping back into port in mid-April 1925. With only 2 aboard, one living and one dead, and yet another damned Cthulhu statue. The old ones may not be bound by Euclidean geometry, but even they have to follow the law of threes. The living man, Gustav Johansen, a second mate in the story, promoted to first mate by the film, and hey, congrats on the promo, Gustav, died under mysterious circumstances, which the film unfortunately omits, shortly after returning to his native Oslo, but not before he wrote out the events of his last voyage on the schooner Emma. The Emma set out from New Zealand in March 1925 and got blown off course by a storm. In the story, the Emma sank after a confrontation with a yacht full of Cthulhu cultists who killed everyone ahead of Johansen in the chain of command before the rest of the Emma's crew could kill them all back. In the film, the Emma's already taking water from storm damage, and it just kind of comes across the fishing trawler alert, abandoned, save for, of course, that Cthulhu statue, and coordinates to a spot on the map where there's not supposed to be anything. For whatever foolish reasons that neither story nor film really justify, the Emma's captain decides to follow the alert's course back to wherever the hell they came. To R'lyeh, of course, where dead Cthulhu waits dreaming. No doubt dreaming of the day when a bunch of dumbass sailors would accidentally release him from his prison grave house, and his mere presence on this planet could once again drive everyone who's even a little bit psychic plumb round the bend. Johansen's account of R'lyeh, as related by our original narrator, is the centerpiece of the story, and it's obvious this production saved all of its pennies for this last big-ticket blowout. And thank Nyarlathotep they did. Here, the use of Dutch angles goes full Dr. Caligari on us, combining with excellent set design to actually make this city work in three-dimensional space. Not quite the way I always pictured it, because of course, what is? But full marks for even trying, much less succeeding. That's more than any of your predecessors can say for themselves. It is a fittingly nightmarish hellscape, like the interior life of a depressed expressionist, or what I imagine Tim Burton sees whenever he closes his eyes. They even found a way to adapt that moment in the story where a crew member falls down a hole that looks like it shouldn't exist from a distance. Kind of makes me want to move to the dimension where Guillermo del Toro really did get the money to make that At the Mountains of Madness movie. But since I can, I'll take more Pacific Rim. What the hell, right? Johansen and his doomed crew flee the god monster, which chases them all the way to the water. In desperation, Johansen rammed the creature and escaped, only to see it immediately reconstitute itself behind him. Because after all, that is not dead which can eternal lie. He told no one of Cthulhu, only committing these facts to a manuscript, which our original narrator begs off Johansen's widow. Fear that Cthulhu might still be out there, and that his cult might even now be targeting everyone who knows even a little bit about him for termination, drove our original narrator to the madhouse. And so the film ends as it began, with our narrator begging his shrink to burn every document. Burn it all! And here's why I don't really mind the frame story. It perfectly fits in with the material. The fact that even reading second-hand accounts of the elder gods can drive you more than a little bit mad, is half the fun and at least a quarter of the horror. The final shot of this picture is a quote that might as well have been Lovecraft's mission statement. Someday, the piecing together of disassociated knowledge will open such terrifying vistas of reality, and our frightful position therein, that we shall either go mad from the revelation, or flee from the deadly light, to the peace and safety of a new dark age. In Lovecraft's time, one could have easily read that as a response to World War I, Spanish flu pandemic that followed it, or, hell, both. Between prohibition at home and the rise of fascism everywhere else, 1920s and early 30s America sure as hell looks like a new dark age. But of course the real strength of that passage, and the implicit horror in it, lies in how applicable it can be to our time, as well as to its authors. In conclusion, fuck the artist. This is the early 21st century retro silent film that should have won all the Oscars. Watch it with the lights off and the sound up. And happy Halloween. It's the most wonderful time of the year.